Hello, and welcome everybody to the first webinar in this series we're calling the CPD Toolkit. We developed this series because last year the Medical Board of Australia introduced broad and sweeping changes to the CPD framework. And this has had an impact on the way in which doctors are consuming and engaging with education. And it's also having an impact on the way in which you, as medical educators, need to think about the design, the accreditation, and the delivery of your CPD programs. When we spoke to a number of medical educators last year, we realised that the changes that were introduced by the MBA were not particularly well understood. And for those who are involved in the financial support or the sponsoring of medical education, we also realised that there was perhaps no awareness of these changes at all. So our aim for this series is to take you through the changes that were introduced by the MBA and to break those down into simple terms so that they're very understandable and that you can apply those changes to the CPD programs that you're seeking to develop. My name is Steve Snow. I'm one of the co-founders of PraxHub, and I'm going to be joined in this series by Rob Beveridge, who's the other co-founder and co-host of this series. At PraxHub, we've developed over 500 CPD educational activities. And what we want to do now is to be able to break down the changes that were introduced by the MBA so that you too can produce great education that has an impact on your customers, but also helps them to meet their ongoing and CPD compliance obligations. So let's jump on into it.
Thanks for that, Steve. Let's look at the agenda for today's webinar. So it's all about CPD, and CPD actually stands for Continuing Professional Development. The reason it's so important for medical practitioners is that to remain licensed as doctors, they need to maintain a minimum CPD level now every year. So we're going to define what CPD is, how it's regulated in Australia. Then we'll move into what's changed recently from the Medical Board of Australia, and then close the webinar with some discussion around what educators need to do when designing programs for doctors. So before we jump into it, let's cover off the housekeeping really quickly. So as we go through the webinar, please feel free to type your questions in through Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer all of them, or as many as possible. And at the end of the webinar, we'll provide you with an opportunity to give us feedback. It'll only take a minute, but we'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So let's get started. Steve, back to you.
Great, thanks, Rob. So how is CPD regulated in Australia? So the peak body for the regulation of all healthcare practitioners in Australia is APRA. And it is constituted by a series of national boards, and one of those national boards being the Medical Board of Australia. And its role, amongst a number of things, is to ensure that doctors in Australia are properly educated on an ongoing basis. And it does this by the development of CPD standards. However, the administration of those standards or the implementation of those standards are carried out by what are known as CPD homes, and they're represented by that last layer on the graphic. So traditionally and historically, there have been 16 CPD homes which have been in the form of specialist medical colleges. And these are colleges which are accredited and approved by the Australian Medical Council. And their role is to develop a curriculum or a set of activities that are relevant to the members of their CPD home. But they also have the function of monitoring ongoing compliance by their members with those CPD standards. So if you were a GP, for example, typically you would belong to either the RACGP or ACRM, and a part of the service that they would provide is a portal through which you could lodge or you could self-record your hours. And as a part of that service, they would also oversee your ongoing compliance with the CPD standards. However, last year, the playing field was opened up to the introduction of more CPD homes. Already, there are 4 new CPD homes on the scene, and with that comes various pros and cons, which I'm going to talk about more very shortly. So what is a CPD program? A CPD program in its most basic form is a body of education that is designed to enhance the skills or the knowledge of the practitioner and at the same time increase patient safety, or we can look at it the other way, which is to reduce risk to the patient. But it is essentially made up of two parts. One is requirements, and they are the requirements that are set by the Medical Board of Australia as a part of the CPD standards. That is really going to be the focus of the webinar today, is to talk you through what have been the changes to the requirements. The other part is the activities, or essentially the set of formats through which the education is delivered. This is such a big topic, we're only going to touch on it today, but we are going to cover this in more detail in the next webinar, so look out for that, which will be coming in April. What are the requirements of a CPD program? So in 2023, the Medical Board of Australia introduced a new set of CPD standards, or a new set of requirements that apply to all registered doctors in Australia. And those changes are, first, is that all doctors now are required to join and belong to an AMC accredited CPD home. The second is that they all now must complete at least 50 hours of CPD education each year. The third requirement is that doctors now are required to develop a professional development plan, otherwise known as a PDP. And finally is to undertake at least one emergency response activity each year. Because the first two requirements are most applicable to yourselves as medical educators, in this webinar, we're just going to focus on requirements 1 and 2. So the first requirement that we're going to talk about is the requirement that all doctors are now required to join a CPD home. And so what that means is, from this year in particular, because a year's grace was given by the MBA, is that doctors need to find and join a AMC accredited CPD home. Prior to this, doctors were in a position where they were able to self-record and self-declare their compliance with their CPD obligations in order to be able to renew their license to practice. However, from this year going forward, they must belong to an AMC accredited CPD home. And while the introduction of CPD homes has had a positive impact in terms of creating competition in the market, it has also potentially had some negative impacts. So on the positive side, when we talk about competition, generally what this does is it has the impact of raising the quality of service, and that's the service provided by the CPD home, and also potentially reduce price, and that's the price paid by the member to the CPD home for delivering that service. But on the negative side, it's also created some confusion in the market, and that's confusion in the market for yourselves, like medical educators, who are seeking to accredit their education with a CPD home. In the past, for example, if you were looking to accredit your education for GPs, it was really simple. You would have considered the RACGP as the largest specialist college of GPs. And if you were seeking to have that education engaged with by remote and rural GPs, you also would have considered ACRM. However, now with the introduction of 4 new CPD homes, all of which have an interest in GPs as being members, you now potentially need to consider 6 CPD homes when accrediting education. We also understand that the Australian Medical Council, or the AMC, are considering applications for further CPD homes, which, as you could say, the positive side is creating greater competition, but on the negative side, for medical educators and those involved in the sponsorship or supporting of medical education, it's creating greater confusion as to which organisation or which CPD home to accredit your education. So with that, just watch this space. And now I'm going to hand over to Rob, who's going to talk through the second requirement.
Thanks for that, Steve. So now that we understand what a CPD home is and why they exist, let's look at what doctors now need to do each year to maintain their CPD obligations. So all doctors in Australia now need to complete 50 hours a year of CPD. To put this in context, if we look at the program that GPs needed to complete prior to 2023, the graphic on the left describes a couple of categories, category 1 and 2, with CPR training. Now, category 1 activities would typically run over a full day workshop or a couple of evenings. They're highly interactive and GPs could earn 40 points for completing those activities. So to reach the 130 points required, a couple of those workshops would take them a long way towards completing their CPD over a 3-year period. Now, if we look at the 50 hours per year requirement on the right-hand side of the table, completing the same activities over a 1-year period would actually only get the GP today to 1/4 of their annual requirements on an hourly basis. So this really demonstrates both the level of effort that a doctor needs to put into completing their CPD and how much that's changed from previous programs. So to sum that point up, this graphic here says that particularly for GPs, but for many other doctors, their annual workload around CPD completion has gone up somewhere in the vicinity of 400%, which is a significant impost on time-poor professionals. And when you boil it down, we're really looking at about an hour a week of accredited education on average for doctors. Okay, let's drill in a little bit further here into these 50 hours. Now, CPD has been split into 3 categories: educational activities, reviewing performance, and measuring outcomes. They all have different requirements of the doctor, but also for medical educators developing programs for these. You might think about an educational activity as a webinar or a dinner meeting. A reviewing performance activity would be something like seeking feedback from patients or from peers or having a case-based discussion. And measuring outcomes activities typically the most involved, in which the doctor's reviewing their performance and looking at how their education has impacted the outcomes of their patients through measurement. And the graphic on the left here describes for GPs the minimum requirement for each of those categories. So it's a minimum of 5 hours for measuring outcomes and reviewing performance, but out of their 50 hours, they need to complete 25 hours at least from those categories, with a minimum 12.5 hours from the educational activities. So this means that the doctor's being challenged and encouraged to really spread their education across a variety of formats with different learning outcomes, but it also challenges and encourages medical educators to consider how to best provide education for the doctors that they work with. Now, to round out the requirements of doctors, we've looked at the hours, we've looked at the categories. There's also these 3 program level requirements on screen, and doctors need to complete at least 1 educational activity that is accredited for these program level requirements, and they don't have to be in a single activity. So to describe these in a little bit more detail, a culturally safe practice activity is really reinforcing that healthcare is delivered free of racism. And in Australia, there is a particular focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, but this can apply to any cultural impact or aspect that relates to the doctor and their practice. When we look at addressing health inequities, this is to ensure that health is delivered as equally as possible across all demographics and parts of Australia, to ensure that we're reducing as much as possible the inequities or inequality that may exist across different parts of the country and different healthcare systems. And finally, the professionalism and ethical practice is really ensuring that the doctor is able to apply their practice in a professional and ethical manner, regardless of the patients that they're seeing. Okay, we've covered a lot about CPD homes and the requirements of doctors. And this really leads us to, I'm sure, a whole bunch of questions as educators who develop programs for doctors. Some questions that I'll leave you with before we get into the Q&A. What topic do you want to educate the doctors on? And really, how is it relevant to their practice? That's a really important question. Should the education be CPD accredited? And if so, is it with one CPD home? Or do you actually need to pick a few to ensure that it's relevant to your target audience? What's the delivery format? Are you doing face-to-face? Are you doing online? What's the best medium? Is it delivered digitally and virtually to maximise reach and engagement? Have you considered the time pressures of your audience and the optimal way to encourage them to participate in your education? Are you providing education on one of those CPD categories, or two of them, or even all three of them? And all of those things are going to impact the resourcing required to develop that, but also the appeal to your intended audience. What type of activity is best to get the clinical or non-clinical message across to your audience? And really importantly, there's two key points here. How are you going to inform your audience of this education activity? And what does success look like for your organisation and for your customers? It's a really important thing to build the program around. So that's the end of our presentation. We're going to jump into Q&A next, and we really look forward to the discussion. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to host you for our first episode of the CPD Toolkit. Please feel free to type questions into Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can, and we've actually got a few already from some of our industry partners. So Steve, I'm going to throw the first one to you. Simple question, but can a doctor be a member of more than one CPD home?
Yeah, so the short answer to that is yes, they can. It's not common for doctors to belong or to join to more than one CPD home. Though I think even in our experience, we've seen GPs who have belonged to both the RACGP and ACRM. The longer answer to that is, even though they can belong to more than one CPD home, they're obligated, or at least they're required to fulfill the CPD obligations or the requirements of at least one of those CPD homes. So even though they may belong to two or more, in order for them to be able to recredit each year, they need to have at least satisfied the 50 hours of at least one CPD home.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Steve. So there's another question that we've had from a number of our partners, and we've obviously considered this as well, which is, with these changes to CPD, what's the general response from doctors been? And I think it's probably worth both of us commenting on this, and I'm going to lead off here. The response has been quite varied, is the short answer. Because there have been, prior to this, the 16 specialist colleges, some of the specialist colleges programs actually haven't changed that much. For example, if you're a physician with the RACP, they were on a time-based or an hours-based program anyway, with a number of different categories. We've certainly seen, though, Steve, a significant change for the GPs, which we've described, and maybe you could talk about some of the feedback from GPs through this year.
Yeah, I think that's right. In terms of the feedback that we've heard in the market, is that for some specialty areas, the move to 50 hours of education per year hasn't been a significant change, or at least a significant impost in terms of their own practice. Certainly when you go into very specialised areas of medicine where they do a lot of hospital-based CPD, or they do training programs that it's attending conferences overseas, racking up 50 hours of education is actually quite straightforward. But in other specialty areas, and I think we particularly look at general practice in this way, is that a lot of GPs do their education outside of their traditional and typical clinical practice hours. And so therefore, completing 50 hours on top of your day-to-day practice can be quite a significant challenge. And I think we look at general practice as probably the example of that. Certainly from what we've heard from GPs and talking to GPs in the market, there are some, and it's always a spectrum, there are some who are completely fine with it. 50 hours, they would have done 50 hours of education prior to the changes handed down by the MBA. And there are some who are really struggling. So I think we're going to see this play out a lot more over the next couple of years. It's still very new, and everyone's really keeping an eye on it.
Yeah, I think there's plenty to unpack in that question, but that's a really good summary. So I want to turn to this question now, and Steve, I'm keen on your thoughts on this particular point, because doctors can self-report and self-record their CPD. So if they read a paper or they go to a meeting, it doesn't have to be accredited for them to then go to their college or their CPD home portal and log that activity for CPD. So what's the value in getting some education accredited?
Yeah, hopefully my thoughts are of some value around this. But There's really sort of two parts to it, I think, in terms of when we look at CPD accreditation. One is a core, probably a perception value, and then the other one is a real practical value. Um, Probably dealing with the second one first, and that's the practical value. So we as an organisation, as a provider, when we go through and we accredit education, we have to go through quite a rigorous process in order to be able to accredit that education. Um, I could go into a lot of detail, but I'm just going to say at a very high level. We engage very closely with doctors around the development of that education. It's developed very independently. And so through that process, what we end up with is a product, an educational product that has gone through the rigors of CPD educational framework. So there's a real practical value in terms of of getting that education CPD accredited. The other is the perception value, and that is that once a piece of education has been accredited with a specialist college or a CPD home, that it then gets the logo that gets attached to that piece of education. And so when doctors are making decisions in the market as to which piece of CPD education they're going to engage with, having that logo or that stamp of approval that's been provided by that CPD home makes it easier for doctors to make quick decisions around the education that they're going to engage with. If one has been accredited, it immediately holds a greater value than that which potentially hasn't been accredited.
I think there's some very comprehensive
Uh,
comments there.
Hopefully that's of some value.
Well, I think that's incredibly well put. And if I look at it even more simplistically, when we've run events for doctors and head to head, some events are not accredited and some are, when you need to earn 50 hours a year, the doctors are constantly looking out, particularly GPs, for something that's not only going to educate them and move their clinical practice forward, but help them to meet those requirements that are now in place. So I'm going to take on this quick question here, which we get again asked regularly, which is pharmaceutical companies are regularly looked at to sponsoring activities. Is there anything holding a drug company back from actually taking that on themselves and becoming a provider and actually accrediting that education? And the simple answer to that is when you look at the CPD requirements of the specialist colleges, the pharma companies and sponsors are prohibited from becoming a provider and accrediting that education themselves in order to keep the interests and the conflicts free, to not really sully the quality and the perception of the credibility around that education. The other question that comes out of that is then, well, if pharma can't accredit education itself, how do doctors perceive education that's funded by drug companies? And I think there's a very, very different answer here, because drug companies are seen as experts in particular fields of medicine, certainly around drugs, procedures, and devices. And it makes complete sense from a doctor's perspective. I'm talking about the majority of doctors here, to actually understand that industry has a role to support the generation of education that's related to their fields of expertise. And in fact, many of our partners will be able to use CPD in the field to actually create value for their customers and improve the relationship that they will have with the prescriber. Steve, question for you, and I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left here, so I think we'll finish on a couple of questions now. With all of these changes now in the market, does that mean that it's easier to now accredit education for a larger variety of specialties?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. With the changes that have been handed down by the NBA, they have standardized the broad requirements of what constitutes CPD education. So previously, when CPD was being implemented or interpreted by the colleges, there were different interpretations of what constituted a CPD program. Now there's greater standardization between each of these CPD homes and the specialist colleges. So in one part, when you're creating or you're accrediting education for one CPD home or one specialist college, it will have some general applicability across the other specialist colleges and CPD homes. However, they all have their own individual nuances and their own individual interpretations or applications of the changes which had been handed down by the NBA. So in one part, it's become a little bit easier. In one part, it's still the same in terms of the nuances that apply to each of the specialist colleges. And of course, as we know, that at times when we are accrediting education for multiple specialist colleges, you still have to go through the same process and the same application process. And for some colleges, that's quite straightforward. In other colleges, it's really quite cumbersome and quite involved in terms of what is needed to be done. So unfortunately, my answer is a little bit equivocal. It is, in some ways, it's a little bit easier with the standardization. In some ways, it's a little bit harder or possibly the same in terms of the involvement in terms of accrediting education with those colleges.
Yeah, I think sums up CPD. In some ways, it can be really straightforward, and in other ways, there's a lot to consider.
Yes.
So I'm going to move on to our final question here, and Steve, I want to get one challenge from you, and then I'm going to add another challenge in. But the question that is posed here is, with all of these changes now in place, what do you think is a key challenge for industry sponsors to consider when they're looking at supporting or developing CPD education for their customers?
For me, always the biggest challenge is around the independence and the perceived independence of education. Sponsorship is obviously such an important part of filling the knowledge gaps within the CPD market. The industry plays such a critical part of being able to support the development of education. And because there are so many therapeutic areas in which to cover, the role of sponsorship is just critical. But there's always the challenges of independence. And we've talked about some of these today, and CPD accreditation is one of those in which you can overcome some of these perceived or independence hurdles. So I think that's always going to remain a challenge. It'll always be an ongoing challenge in industry. But the more that companies produce high quality and well-regarded education, it starts to park or sort of partition the issues of independence.
I think it's a very well made point. While we're in the last minute, I think I would provide a different challenge that's no less important, and that challenge is, from our experience, is making sure the objective of the program has actually been established at the outset. And by that I mean there's two parts. What's the objective of the sponsoring organisation? Are they seeking to generate awareness? Are they looking to improve clinical behaviour? Are there other objectives that the education is being designed to achieve? And marrying that up with the objectives that the participants might have going into that education. So working out, like any good project, what are the objectives up front allows us to all work together to line up the program and have some hope of achieving those objectives. So we're getting the wind up from behind the camera. Steve and I would really like to thank you all for your attendance. We really appreciate your interest in this activity. This is the first episode of what we hope will be something that we can turn our attention to every 4 to 6 weeks. So we'll stay in touch with you. Before we sign off, please, in the browser that opens when the meeting ends, there's a really short survey. We'd love to hear your thoughts on our first webinar. It's only going to take you a minute to complete. And with that, thanks again, and we'll see you soon.